So they revealed the plot for Rosa of Recapture, the new characters, and nightmare frames. And let's just say people aren't happy about it, but at least the reactions have been amazing.
Somehow
Britannia
returned.
Oh shit, here we go again.
You can't do this to me.
You know how much I sacrificed?
The fans seem to have three major issues. Number 1, it undermines the Zero Recum, Lelouch's magnum opus. Number 2, the plot seems too ridiculous given the current state of the world. And number 3, this seems like an unoriginal rehash of the original anime. Let's go through each one to determine if these complaints have any merit to them. Then I'll present my issues with Rosa of Recapture's plot. So starting with the big one, does Rosa of Recapture ruin the Zero Recum? Well, yes and no. It is frustrating that a conflict longer than Lelouch's rebellion occurred only 3 years after the Zero Recum. The implication is that Lelouch was a failure. At least with Zilkstan, the nation was outside of the UFN, and it was resolved fairly quickly. In this case, Japan, a member of the UFN, was the victim of a preventable invasion. Remember, they still have the same people in power, including Schneizel. This could also imply that Lelouch's plan would never work to begin with, and thus the Zero Recum was pointless. He destroyed Britannia only for Britannia to rise again. He created a system for humanity to move into the future, only for the opposite to occur. I guess when Lelouch wiped out the opposing factions after becoming emperor, he forgot about Norland and the Einberg members. Amidst these issues, it's important to look at the bigger picture before concluding that this recent ongoing conflict invalidates the Zero Recum. First, let's acknowledge the fact that Neo-Britannia only controls one area in Japan, not the whole country and not the whole world. So for now, it's contained in Japan. Moving on, let's talk about the current state of the world outside of the conflict. It appears that the other nations are united and working together to stop Neo-Britannia. So at least the United Federation of Nations still exists. Although from the exclusive trailer, the other nations seem displeased, but are at least still united. So in short, the conflict shows both the failures and the successes of the Zero Recum. It could prevent a large conflict from occurring, but at least everyone's working together to stop it, which was the point of the Zero Recum. This of course assumes that sending in Rosa and Ash isn't a sign of failure as well. It is also possible that the absence of Lelouch and C2 could demonstrate that this conflict isn't that serious, relatively speaking. We're going to need more information to determine that. Let's move on to the next complaint, that the plot is quite ridiculous. On some level, it is. How did seemingly a whole army arrive in Japan, take over an area without anyone noticing them, or stop them for that matter? The reason why many compare this plot to The Force Awakens is because in that film, a destroyed empire all of a sudden comes back to full power with almost no explanation. At least in that film, a generation went by. In this case, it's only been a few years. Where were these Einberg members during the events of the original anime, films, or manga? If they can fight the Black Knight's toughest soldiers, you would think they would have appeared earlier. At least with Ozma the Reflection, the story introduced the Glinda Knights as a team that formed after R1 and retconned the story with them partaking in the events of R2, mostly behind the scenes. Are they going to do the same thing in this case? If so, it's going to be a tall feat since there are a ton of new characters in this story. If you were wondering why does Resurrection avoid this criticism, well that's because the film handled it better. It's another nation not associated with Britannia. The military is powerful, but was never a genuine threat to Britannia. A small army of badasses took out their forces, and they later surrendered when Schneizel brought the rest of the army. I am also willing to accept that a few talented pilots could exist that we didn't see in any previous Code Geass media, but in this case, there's just too many. You have the Einberg members, and even Ash and Rosa. And of course, of the Einberg members, Norland seems to be a pretty big deal. Very hard for me to accept the fact that we have never heard this character until this point. In general, it's a lot of things to accept at one time. The next problem here is how the Neo-Britannian military has held back the Black Knight forces for over 4 years. There's a ton of issues here. If this was the only major conflict going on, then Suzaku, Colin, Toto, Anya, Cornelia, Guilford, Jeremiah, Gino, Aldrin, that's right. Since Oz and Akito are canon to this universe, they count as well. So continuing on with that, Akito, the Wyvern Squad, the Glinda Knights, and now the Zilkstan forces should have been sent in. So the question is, why weren't they? And I came up with two theories. They didn't send any of them to fight Neo-Britannia, or worse, the writers nerfed these pilots so as to prop up the Ironberg as a legit threat. Either outcome is quite frustrating. If there are pointless character deaths, I'm gonna be pissed. I'm sure many might argue that these soldiers might have been prisoners during war. Maybe they were fighting in a different conflict during the Zero Requiem, similar but also different than the Glinda Knights in 02. Perhaps they were in the EU or somewhere else. Of course, since they formed Neo-Britannia, they must be from or loyal to Britannia. Next is the shield problem. Sure, the shield prevents the Black Knights from taking over the Hokkaido block, but what's to stop them from sieging it or preventing resources from entering it? I think the shield is the same as the one from the Damocles, just a stronger version, since you can see something that looks like the Damocles in the exclusive trailer. If it works the same, that means that the barrier opens up when traveling to and from the Hokkaido block. If the Shinkiro could keep it open, I'm sure modern Nightmare frames have better methods to do the same. Assuming it's not a magic barrier, it is hard to understand why this conflict isn't resolved using basic military tactics. You could argue this about the original anime, but there are some important considerations in that. 1. Britannia was dealing with conflicts all around the world, whereas here this is the only major conflict. 2. The Black Knights weren't holding Tokyo hostage, they were working within it. 3. Once things got serious, then Britannia sent out the big guns and basically defeated the Black Knights. 4. Lelouch used brilliant strategies to lead the Black Knights against Britannia. I doubt Neo-Britannia has something similar if they're relying on a barrier to keep things going. And 5. Early on, Britannia wasn't expecting a major rebellion, hence why Clovis was in charge, and how the Black Knights rose up so fast. But in this case, they are ready for a conflict. As we saw in Zilkstan, it's not too difficult to mobilize the army to handle a conflict, and you could come up with even more differences, so these conflicts are quite different. If they have the same UFN members from Resurrection, this conflict should have ended a while ago. Another problem with the shield is how they got it into Japan in the first place. It's gigantic and can surround an entire city. How the hell do you create or smuggle that in without anyone noticing? You can give an explanation, but I'm probably not gonna like it. Now, despite these issues, here are some possible explanations for how this happened. Maybe Neo-Britannia formed, just like the Black Knights, in a slow, methodical manner over several years. This could be a plan set by Charles following his death, or failure to create the Ragnarok connection, or both. The UFN could be involved. Perhaps there are traitors working on the inside. Maybe it's worse than that, and someone cancelled Lelouch's Geass on Schneizel, and he's helping the Neo-Britannian Empire. Zilkstan wasn't originally part of the UFN, so maybe other nations in a similar boat sponsored Neo-Britannia in exchange for helping them out. It's the same type of exchange between India and the Black Knights. In terms of getting the whole army to Japan, that one would be difficult to explain. Smuggling in the Ironberg members and their nightmare frames is one thing, but tons of soldiers is another. Maybe it was through traditional immigration means, I don't know. And of course, the most obvious explanation for all of this, Geass. Someone in Neo-Britannia has one and used it to advance their plans like what Lelouch did in the original anime. Although in that case, it might be a survivor of the Geass Order. That would be an interesting plot twist where destroying the Order nearly destroyed the Zero Requiem. Lelouch's darkest moment nearly covered the light from the Zero Requiem. I'm just throwing out ideas here at this point, grasping for straws if you will. Oh, and as a side note, I hope to explain what is so important about the Hokkaido block and why it was never mentioned in the original anime. From the images, it's an impressive city that you would think would have come up by now, but oh well. Moving on to complaint number 3. The plot is unoriginal. This is probably the biggest reason for the comparisons to The Force Awakens, as it's also an unoriginal story when compared to A New Hope. But why is Rosa of the Recapture such an unoriginal story? Well, let's list the elements that it has. Britannia is the villain. again. They are occupying Japan. Again. They're killing Japanese people. Again. And it's up to a resistance group to save them. Again. That's too many agains for one story. It is depressing that compared to their other creative works, like Akito the Exiled, Ozma the Reflection, Resurrection to some extent, Nightmare of Nunnally, Lancelot and Gurren, Genesis RE Code, even taking into account the bad stories, lost stories, and the original anime, I speak for everyone when I say,
This was the best you could do.
I mean, they've been working on this for a long time, probably over 5 years. Maybe even before they were working on Resurrection, since Resurrection sets up Rosa of Recapture as its sequel. If this was their grand plan from the beginning, then they should have worked instead on adapting the Geass manga. As I said, those stories are way better and would probably be a commercial success. Remember, they can do whatever they want with the property, and they chose this. It's why many believe that the creators have no idea what to do with this IP, and that's why the 10-year plan has been all over the place, Rosa included. Now, to be fair, you can rehash a similar story while making it feel fresh with competent writers. The problem here is that it's too similar and it's too soon, which is frustrating. I don't blame people who read the synopsis and came to the conclusion that they are just milking Geass at this point. Even the gacha games have more original content than this. But despite the similar sounding plots, the circumstances are different from the original anime, and there are things that we simply don't know. It is an interesting what-if scenario if Britannia tried to reform under a unified post-Zero Recum world. Since the end of R2, people have always wondered if Lelouch's plan would actually work in the long term. Well, now we're going to find out. Geass might play a bigger role in the story, and the plot twist could be crazy, potentially elevating the original anime. Beyond the issues with the similar plot, I think fans just don't want this, and who could blame them? Resurrection's ending teased the journey of L2 and C2 fighting Geass users and gathering the Geass shards, and instead we're getting a small-scale rehash of R1 and R2 with a random blonde kid and a Ryo lookalike with blazes in their hair as the main protagonist. So overall, while you can defend these complaints and the series will hopefully address them, the fact still remains they are all valid. And on some level, I'm with you guys. The past few days have been frustrating to say the least. Now let's move on to my personal gripes with everything concerning Rosa of the Recapture. I'm not happy that Rosa of the Recapture seems disconnected to the previous works. So far, the story doesn't seem to connect to the events of Oz, Akito, or even Resurrection for that matter. Instead, it seems like an isolated story when it shouldn't be at this point. Remember, it's a sequel, not a mequel. It reminds me of those Marvel films where even though other heroes exist in this universe, they don't appear to help out when there's a major threat. This leads to serious problems in the story. Obviously, those characters and settings could exist in this anime, but they chose to not reveal it in the trailers or the recent announcements. I do have my doubts about this, since even the information surrounding the story doesn't indicate a connection with everything else. Would small hints and nods really be that difficult to show in a trailer? They gave away the new Democles, but couldn't give away Akito, Layla, or Aldrin. This complaint extends to the main universe. Where are the hints to the members of the UFN? It's only been 5 years since Resurrection. Everyone should still be alive. Unless it's like Mass Effect 2, where everyone from your squad just moved on to other things. Although in that case, it made more sense. Here, not so much. The trailer only focused on everything that's new as opposed to a combination of old and new. I don't know why they did this, but hopefully things don't look as bad as they seem. My last issue is the pace of the story elements. Everything is just happening too fast and too soon. A new empire has risen, the Sumeragi family has other members, the Black Knights have been locked in a war for years, Rosa and Ash are a thing. There's just so much new stuff that it's hard to digest all of it. Again, all this happened a year after Resurrection. If this was 10 to 15 years later, it wouldn't bother me as much. The writers are going to have to spend a lot of their time playing catch up with the audience. something they didn't have to do in Resurrection since there was more old than new in that story. 12 episodes doesn't seem like enough time to accomplish this. I'd argue that R2 was too short and rushed at 25 episodes, so what hope do they have with this? It sounds like this is going to be a one and done thing. Rosa will only be 4 films or 12 episodes. This is disconcerting not only for the series itself, but the future of Code Geass anime content. So far in this video, it's mostly been negative opinions on Rosa of the Recapture since that's the current sentiment. So let's change course and discuss some positive elements of the series. First of all, I like the design for the Z Apollo and the new characters, although I do have mixed feelings on the designs for the new Nightmare frames, and the CGI kinda sucks. Besides that, the art style and animation look incredible. Now my thoughts on this anime didn't start out positively. I didn't like the first trailer. It came across as just another action mecha anime with only a superficial connection to Code Geass. But then I watched the exclusive trailer and the pendulum swung in the other direction. This actually looked great. There's some awesome characters, great set pieces, and more importantly, Geass elements. There was clearly passion put into this project, and that doesn't mean it gets an automatic pass, but it does mean we shouldn't just dismiss it outright because the plot is similar to the original anime. Something about this seems more authentic than the Marvel and Disney sludge we get nowadays. Now I will admit that the recent updates have swung the pendulum in the other direction, but not fully. I still remain optimistic for this series, even though there are things about it that piss me off. But the most important thing to remember is that it hasn't come out yet. It's hard to judge it until we know everything. But I will admit, some questions may not have satisfying answers. Let's hope they are good enough. I know they can tell great stories besides the original anime. Oz of the Reflection and the recent Lost stories are both excellent examples of this. But for every Oz and Lost stories, you have Janzari Code and Renia of Darkness. I hope this story is going to be more like the former and not the latter. And just to make this clear, I am rooting for this project's success. With that success could come future projects like adapting the manga or expanding the lore in other ways. The thing with Code Geass is there are so many avenues to explore, and it's fascinating how the creators don't realize this or choose to play it safe with these recent projects. But with this, it's a combination of playing it safe, but also trying something new. The story feels familiar, but with a brand new cast of characters. This could be the first anime in Code Geass where Lelouch doesn't play a large role, or maybe doesn't appear at all. That alone is a huge risk that I hope pays off. I know many won't watch anything without Lelouch, and with this story seemingly shitting on his legacy, it's going to make it even harder for those fans to give it a chance. Another reason why this was not the best direction to go for the story. Still, I think all fans should at least give it a chance. For those who absolutely hate this thing right now, my advice would be to go in with low expectations. Take it for what it is, and roast it later on if it turns out to be a pile of garbage, or celebrate if it turns out to be a hidden gem. For me, I'm looking forward to this with realistic expectations. I want the world, but probably gonna have to settle for much less. I know these writers can tell amazing stories, so let's hope they knock it out of the park. But they will definitely have quite a difficult hill to climb, especially since they put themselves in a bad starting position.